There we go. Well, Andrew, is there anything you'd like to tell us about yourself? I gave the briefest of all possible introductions.
Well, I'm an Anglican priest, was ordained at the age of 23 in 1988. So did 14 years in parish ministry, then moved to a college in Oxford, a Roman Catholic college of higher education, and ended up as a head of department there, which is quite unusual, don't usually allow that. And then I moved to Pembroke College as chaplain and lecturer in theology, and I did some work for Ripon College, Cuddesdon again. I teach a lot for the Anglican theological colleges, which is great. It's great to see how the particular inspiring motivation that people who are training for ministry have. It's lovely to be speaking to you. I guess you're in the Austin area. It says on the invite. One of the reasons that there is a chaplaincy, I'll talk about chaplaincy in a minute, but in the particular of Pembroke, there was a man called Damon Wells, who was a student at Pembroke in the 50s, I think, probably. And he maintained a very good relationship with the college. He endowed a professorship in history. He renovated or paid for the renovations of the chapel. And then this is a good thing. If any of you do any teaching, remember this story. I will never forget it. There was a student from the United States, from Texas actually, oops, I better be careful, who was perhaps the least accomplished student I've ever had to teach. And it was a hard subject, trying to teach him Greek. I was teaching Greek because I'm not naturally a linguist, and I find it difficult, so I try to find ways of helping people to learn. But this particular guy was quite exhausting. Every week we had to start again, but miraculously he passed his exam. I have no idea how this happened. And then we got a message from Damon Wells saying, my godson has just passed his Greek. How did you not strangle him? And because I didn't strangle him, he then endowed the chaplaincy with £1.4 million to keep, because he said something very wise and very nice for me. But he knew that in the days ahead, there would be a lot of calls upon money from the Higher Education Funding Council in Britain, and it would be very difficult to justify the expenditure of a denominationally based chaplain. So he was kind enough to help the college to maintain that. I have to admit that there is iniquity in this, because Pembroke College now has a chaplain, and according to our statutes, an Anglican one. It's very diverse, the picture of higher education. It'd be interesting to hear from your bishop what it's like in Texas. But there are some universities where there is one chaplain for 20, 30, 40,000 people. I am chaplain for a college of about 800 or 900 people. So it's a tremendous privilege, to be honest, and disproportionate. So I admit that, I confess it this Lenten tide, that I'm actually very lucky and blessed in that. But I thought I'd talk about, if it's okay, you can interrupt, please interrupt at any time. Thinking about 14 years in parish ministry, and I'm guessing about the same amount of time, or a bit longer actually, 17 years I think I've been, yeah. What do they have in common? And I think talking about basics, particularly from the Church of England's point of view, it's a life lived with a community and in a community, most of all. And that means there are certain expectations on us as clergy to articulate certain things. I think there are some absolutely basic things that I have sometimes forgotten. And life has a wonderful way of bringing you up short. If you stop thinking that actually you've got to keep on being a learner as well as a mentor and teacher. I think when I knew Bertie, was I in Sheffield at that point, Bertie?
I think at Cuddesdon, Pembroke, full time, I think.
Oh, okay, so it's quite recent. Okay, I was a priest in Sheffield. My the first parish I had, which was an incredibly poor parish. it was one of the 25 poorest wards in the United Kingdom. And when we were there, we were married, my wife and I. My wife got something called a blockage in her pelvic uteric junction, which meant that her kidneys packed in. And that was very frightening for us. But every time I got back from the hospital in this poorest of parishes in Sheffield Diocese, someone had been and cooked food. And these were from a community where there just wasn't any disposable spare money at all. It was generations of people who were unemployed. It wasn't working class, it was ingrained non-working class. And I felt so awful about this. I felt sickened. And I realized actually I can't vicariously stop people being generous. And it was when I began to accept the ministry of the poorest, the kindness, the gifts of the poorest, that I think I became their priest. Up till then, I'd been something else. I don't know what I'd been, somebody with a sort of, who thought they got something about them. But actually at that point, something happened. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there was a sort of reciprocity that took place. Now, I think there is something very similar wherever we are, in higher education, in parishes, in structures, that actually, unless we are open to receiving as well as giving, and it's harder to receive. I know that it's much easier to give. It gives you that little bit of a sort of flourish. You think you're being kind to others, and you think you're at the center. But if you, in a sense, if you are receiving, you realize your own poverty, and I think that's something that's very difficult to own sometimes in an academic institution like Oxford, where everyone is so anxious to stand on their own accomplishments. But I remember looking back at the moments where actually there's been breakthrough in ministry, both in parish and in a academic setting, have been hallmarked by that reluctant acceptance to both learn something new and that to cost one's own sort of sense of posture, to enable oneself to be in communion, I guess, with people as they are. And that's certainly higher education chaplaincy in the UK, as I pointed out, is extremely diverse. And Oxbridge, and to a certain extent the University of Durham, are in a way very, very privileged places. They work on the assumption that they are excellence is the thing that they look for. I think Oxford and Cambridge, together with the Ivy League universities of the US, are recognized as sort of, both in terms of teaching and learning and research, sort of world leading. But with that comes a bit of pride, to be honest, and with students, as I'm sure you're aware, a sense of imposter syndrome. Lots of students who come to Oxford will come from schools where they have been told they are incredible and gifted and talented, and so they are. But then they come into an environment where everybody's in that same boat. Suddenly, they're not. They can't just think on the sixpence. They have to do work. They have to actually do things, and a lot of that. A crushing of the ego can take place, not in a good way, I mean in a devastating manner. When I went to Pembroke, one of the things that puzzled me a little bit was the social and financial privilege of most of the students there. We have moved that extraordinarily dramatically over the last 15 years. From it, I think, when the UK talks about public school, we mean private school. I don't know what that's about. But when I went there, something like 78% of students were from privately educated public schools, where in a sense you would have to, it would be perhaps twice the average salary of a person to send their child to that school. And less than 10% of the British population go to those schools. So of that 10%, it shows just how disproportionate it was. Now we have a majority of people from state schools, so we've moved quite dramatically, and doing so in a way that's not tokenist or woke, a word I've learnt from. Oh gosh, the bishop's now having to put layers on. I presume if she hasn't got, can you send her a light, sort of a heater or something? Because obviously it's cold there. But that sense of privilege often masks a whole host of pastoral issues, which I'm sure you're aware of, are inevitably going to be there. But if people have been to public school and come from with an expectation that they're going to flourish, the pressures are enormous and well hidden. So much of our job as priests anyway, but particularly perhaps in higher education, is understanding the world in which people are set, but daring to loiter with intent. That doesn't sound very focused in terms of pastoral planning. I do believe pastoral planning is really significant. We'll come back to that. But I think it has to be marked with a sense of awareness and openness for the possibility of being surprised. And loitering with intent can actually mean that you can pick up things and see things. Now, as well as being chaplain, I'm also fellow, so I teach patristic and modern theology and spirituality, and look particularly in art. Most of the things I've written recently have been about art and interfaith. I've just come off the line from talking to one of the apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah. We were discussing one or two things because we've had some dialogues, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Protestant, Reformed, and Restored, i.e. Mormon, dialogue is taking off here. And that took off in Pembroke. I was very pleased to be part of that, because that stretches what's normally understood to be the respectable bubble. It's all right to have Anglican, Catholics, and Orthodox, isn't it? But actually to talk to people from a new religious movement who only in 1972, I think it was, voted to properly admit people of colour into the priesthood and into temple worship. Interestingly enough, they are now very, very much involved in, is it AARCP? Have I got that right? African American? Somebody correct me. But there's an agency, AARP, Bishop?
Do you mean the NAACP?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yes, and they're having very good connections with that group, and have moved pastorally in the last 2 years since I've been involved to rework and to change attitudes towards, for example, issues of gender and sexual orientation and the measuring of people on gender lines, and also on the issue of marriage and having children. It's quite ingrained, but it's like many of these things, when you get to know the people who are trying to steer a church away from certain rigid attitudes, it's quite interesting to see just how far people move, and particularly in the recent political. I promised Bertie I wouldn't mention politics, but I'm mentioning it as a reportage of what I always thought of as a conservative, a socially conservative group. But and Utah, of course, did vote for President Trump, but the Mormon Church of the United States, actually has tried to remain neutral in terms of politics, because I think that's quite important from a point of view of remaining neutral for your equivalent of the Charity Commission. But are quite, well, very relieved. And to see what happened to Mitt Romney, whom I know very vaguely, was quite awful to see the way in which he was abused, both in an airport and on a plane. But anyway, that's one of the things then about being a chaplain to a small community, is that as well as all the teaching and stuff, and the Book of Common Prayer Anglicanism that goes on every day, that breathing out and breathing in, the beauty of a tradition where somehow the substance is conveyed in the measured poetry of English of the 17th century, is that in fact you're the chaplain to everybody, and Anglican priesthood has always been about that. But it's lovely to have relationships, good relationships with the Muslim community, the Jewish community in college. There's one Buddhist person in her community, in college at least, and the chaplaincy committee, we've expanded it to have faith representatives, but not just denominational ones, but faith reps. I find that really encouraging and powerful, that one is chaplain to everybody there, regardless of their faith tradition. And one of the things which I do to people I teach, which I think would probably be illegal in the United States, certainly in the school system, is everybody I teach, I will tell them at some point, probably not the first meeting, that I'm praying for them on the 26th day of every month, and promise to do so until I die. And that comes as a bit of a shock, not that it's not a sort of when I'm planning to die, but the sense in which, and one or two people have reacted quite interestingly. One student said, well, that's very entitled of you. I can't understand why it's entitled of me. And it just said, and another one said, well, is it negotiable? Can you not pray for us if we ask you not to? And I said, well, honestly, no, but I'm telling you just in the interest of openness. And the one who thought it was very entitled of me, there was a knock on the door, and I said, I know it's not the 26th of the month, but I need you to pray for me. So it's just a way of opening the door a little bit. And I can do that because of the position of being chaplain, as well as teaching patristics and church history and modern theology, and the Jesus paper, which is a new paper that we've introduced at prelims level, spirituality and art. And it's good to be able, I mean, this week, Zoom is great. You know, I've been to Utah this afternoon. I'm now in Austin. Earlier on this week, I was in Calcutta. There's a Hindu, well, he was Hindu, a person who's now planning to be baptized, but he can't do it in India because he will need to go to a court to say he's not been coerced. So because we're all under lockdown, he's still in Calcutta. So we're planning his baptism when he comes back, having looked at the Jesus paper. So it's through an intellectual tradition, but it's, and there's a lovely guy called Ahmad, who is Muslim, who's got a man crush, he says, on Martin Luther. And I love this sort of sense in which he said, if I were a Christian, I know I'd be a Lutheran. And then he says lots of things about why, and it's about God dying on the cross, God taking ultimate responsibility, and not trying to assign it's just the humanity that, if you like, that's sacrificed. So these are tremendously inspiring young people who are from across the world. We have somebody from Scandinavia I'm teaching tomorrow, and he is Reformed, he describes himself, so I guess he might be Calvinist. But there's this sense in which the university, perhaps sometimes if we're in the flesh, which we're not at the moment, there's a sense in which we can miss this. But if we are actually on a Zoom meeting and you can see in the background, if you like, Calcutta and everything, there's a tremendous way in which the university brings the universe to one, and the tremendous privilege of intellectual ministry with an intellectual edge. So I am aware of that wonderful diversity, the wonderful privilege, the sense of not having to raise parish share. Bishop ought not to listen to this bit, but I remember in a parish trying to raise money, which the church needs. Money isn't a nasty thing, but the struggle of trying to constantly creatively think of ways of raising money, and the grave temptation that somehow it is the vicar or the priest or the rector's job to do that. I think it was, again, slowly learning that talking to people honestly about saying things like, you know, I really don't have an idea about how we're going to raise this amount of money for the last church where I was a minister, excuse me, was an old Augustinian priory, which had 9 altars, and became Anglican in the English Reformation. But you can imagine the cost of maintaining that building, and then the temptation of falling into the church is just about build bricks and mortar rather than ministry, and trying to find a way. And ridiculous and obvious. I mean, this is the point. Obvious, really. Why do we find things difficult to learn? Because I think that we try to make it too complex, and we try to think it's our own responsibility. It was when talking to other people that other people have actually thought and took and ran with things which I couldn't possibly. So it was, in a sense, in the UK, I was ordained in '88, and I think even then the idea of the vicar being a one-person band was collapsing. But I don't know about the US, but now it is much more of a generally recognized that the Christian community are not there to help the vicar, as John Betjeman says in his poems about the PCC, but actually the vicar is there to support, encourage, and ask creative questions rather than be, if you like, that sort of leader on a white charger making everything okay, which is just as well because I can't ride. Well, I then thought, again, what's necessary for appropriate ministry in the higher education area? And of course, it goes without saying that if you're teaching, you have to keep research active. You have to establish some sort of credibility as a dialogue partner with students and with other staff. But what's necessary in particularly the Christian ministry in higher education, I put high upon it integrity. We had a really dark time. Guess what? 7, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, perhaps, when the LGBTQ plus community, which wasn't called that then, I think it was the Gay and Bisexual Society of Oxford, asked if we would fly a rainbow flag from the college, and somebody in the governing body said, no, the governing body will not accept that. We've discussed it and said no. No, we hadn't. And that was, it wasn't that this guy was prejudiced. I mean, his daughter, he was very supportive of his daughter in a lesbian relationship, but it was just that he didn't want to talk about a subject that he thought was taboo with governors whom he thought were sort of stuck in a different century. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. When it came out, it made it almost impossible. Well, it did make it impossible for him to continue because he had misrepresented the governing body. But in the meantime, when all this was going on, the chaplaincy committee decided that we would have a rainbow flag in chapel. We would have it as a backdrop to an icon of Noah. An Orthodox member of the community brought an icon of Noah, illustrating God's universal covenant with all creation. And that actually was, I can understand the controversial nature of that, because 1 or 2 churches in Oxford reacted very strongly against that. Just as when we've had interfaith speakers, sometimes people have reacted against that. There was a call from somebody in Scandinavia. I've forgotten his name, but he was behind the attack upon the children on one of the Swedish islands from the Labour Party, and there were several people killed, and he said that the chaplain and the college ought to be a target. And the police took that seriously, much more serious than we did. We thought, oh, this is just a strange person. But it's reminded me that actually there has to come a point when, if you like, for the point of integrity, not for the point of just being sort of vogue or woke, that's the word, but where we have to stand and say there are costs of discipleship. And it was very interesting to see, it was things like that which could have been incredibly divisive with faith communities. Even the Anglican family, which you know better than me, is prone to splitting on this, that, and the other. it actually made us come together and think, right, well, whatever we think about gay marriage, for example, it's not appropriate to have these sort of violent attitudes or to stand with them. And somehow it's sometimes that openness to unexpected risk-taking, that's appropriate risk-taking, that actually proves fruitful. One of the things I suppose I would say I'm a bit surprised about is the unexpected liaisons that have happened between the chapel and chapel groups. When I went to Pembroke, they'd had a very evangelical chaplain who had been pushed out really by the chapel, by the college hierarchy, and therefore the Christian Union were really quite antagonistic, and for a long time didn't really want to have anything to do with the chaplain or chaplaincy. And I guess it's only in about the last 4 years probably that I meet with the CU members once a week, and we pray together, and a great deal of trust has emerged, which has also enabled us to to challenge some things. Remember, there was we have people from the CU now preach once a term when we have chapel. We're not having services at the moment because of lockdown, and sometimes things get said which can be pretty insensitive. One person mentioned somebody, people who are disabled who haven't prayed for healing, and there was a member of staff there who was born disabled. We have a person on placement from Wycliffe who was head of the British Universities Christian Unions, and he has been a tremendous facilitator to try to help people be more sensitive and open, without that being perceived to be a somehow losing of one's credibility within one's tradition. So I think there has to be that openness to unexpected liaison, not just with other faiths, but within one's own tradition. And we do have a very good relationship now with the CU, with Orthodox and Catholic colleagues just over the road, with the Latter-day Saints. Do we have a good relationship with the Anglicans? I hope so, although they're the ones that perhaps only come once or twice a term in terms of preachers and things. And I think that's important, that we do get people who represent faith traditions. One of the blessed things we have as a college is a choir, which has to be, goodness knows how it's going to be restored when we have sung services again. But it had got quite good in terms of students and members of staff. And we have a relationship now with Christ Church Cathedral School, which is just across the road. And so we have, I think, 12 trebles from there. We have about 12 adults in other parts. Parents now come. So at one point, chapel seemed really rather poorly attended, which was a shame because
it's 19 hours.
Because beautiful things were happening. But what's now the case is actually we have 50 or 60 people in a chapel which can only really seat 100 maximum. And when it's things like the 9 lessons and carols, we have massive overload. Now, that's not about the sort of pride of numbers, but in this country, numerical attendance at churches is very significantly lower, I think, than in the US. And so it's finding ways of inclusivity and mutuality, which mean that people will come and be exposed to the worshipping life of the Christian community and a variety of perspectives. So it's not monochrome. We have, if you like, by taking appropriate risks, by having people to come and speak, and some of them will need to be addressed afterwards. So I think that's what I would say is necessary in chaplaincy, is no real, why am I bothering talking to you? Because you know this from parochial ministry. But all I'd say is don't be afraid to take appropriate risks, knowing what it's for, that we honour our office by emptying ourselves of as much of our prejudice as we can. And that means seeing it sometimes for the first time, which is an ugly thing. If I'm, yeah, one of the things about that's particularly perhaps touched the world in terms of the American election is that there are some attitudes that one all we have, which are held up before us. And I would say that on all sides, to be honest. So what am I leaving behind? I'm not retiring, by the way, at least I don't hope I'm not. God may have something else in mind. Well, I think there's always that, as well as the making new roads with an institution like in higher education, which is enormously changing. I'm not sure how it's happened in Texas, but in this country, 2 lockdowns. There are no students present in Oxford at the moment, apart from medics who have to be there. But with all of that change means, in a sense, we have to have, Benedict says, the endless willingness to begin again. And that means, above all perhaps, that increasing self-awareness is progressive. I hope that the chaplaincy is a place of truth, beauty, love, acceptance, but of truth, where people can learn to understand themselves, see themselves first, then begin to understand it in community and in conversation with others. And people can learn to voice and to make decisions about their future, not just in a sense to feather their own nest, but above that, that sense of inspiring. The chapel is a place of inspiring service, I hope. That's the title of a book which is published both in the US and here in the UK, Inspiring Service, where Rowan Williams, Francis Young, David Alton, the senior Roman Catholic layman in this country, Geoffrey Holland, who's one of the 12 apostles of the Mormon Church, and myself worked together to try to draw people together in terms of scholarship and of service. So I suppose I'm aware, and I thought about this today, it sounds a bit apocalyptic, that after being here about 17 years, this is probably at age 56, possibly my last post. Therefore, I've got to do all I can to make it count. I don't entirely agree with the prayer of John Wesley, do not let me live to be useless, but actually, I think there's one can't stand on what's happened or achieved, because in a sense we are always changing, and I suppose it's about being committed above all to those people who are committed to our charge. There's been a lot, I don't know where it probably works the same in parishes, but there's been times when the phase or the focus of ministry has been much more on the serving staff. We call them scouts, people who clean students' rooms, people who work in the kitchens, people who serve food, people who work in the administration wing of the college. That's taken a great deal of time and energy. Whenever there are groups of people who feel ignored or lost or not understood, young academics in this country are not well paid at all. There is a big differential within a college where you get some professors earning £100,000 a year or more, and some young academics earning £22,000 a year. And it's the young ones probably who've got family. So there's all of those issues. And I remember one of the former bursar, when we were once talking about this, said, are you a chaplain or are you a trade union official? Well, I found that quite a compliment, actually, because in a sense, to stand up for and to ask the questions about, well, how can people live in Oxford? Oxford's a very expensive place to live, like London. And so even to rent a house in Oxford, you're talking £1,500 a month. How can we expect young academics or people who who actually serve us our food, who clean up after us, who maintain the gardens, who clean the lavatories, who do all the tedious number crunching in the administration to survive on such a little amounts of money. They're not little amounts of money, if you like, on a world basis, but locally they are. So I guess it's that always being open to what the issue, where the not sense of injustice, but where the pastoral needs are. I mean, this time, I don't know if you've got family at university and how it's working in the US, but if you've got, people at home, I've taught 3 terms now by Zoom, and it's not the same. I mean, if I were there in the flesh, we would, and it weren't COVID, I could see the twinkling in your eye. We could have a cup of coffee. We could actually have a hug. I would hug Bertie, inappropriate as that might be, but in a sense we're made bodily, and I do worry about having to teach on a flat screen which is not 3D, seeing, if you like, the purging for good reason of intimacy for lots of ways. There was a lot. I mean, the Church of England in particular, I'm sure maybe the case in the United States as well, but the Church of England has abused that intimacy quite seriously in the past, and we can't go back to that. But we can't actually not pick somebody up off the floor if they fall over, but just tell them to stand up. There has to be a sense of appropriately inhabiting our bodiliness, and not being phobic about things which are grubby or not sterilized. And clearly at the moment I understand all of that, but I hope that we move quite quickly to understand what an appropriate way of behaving and being is after the COVID world. But at the moment, that's my concern, is I'm having people Zoom in, literally, and talk about their issues at home. People who are coming particularly from backgrounds where there isn't an expectation or a practice of the academy, finding it very difficult to work, feeling disillusioned, not being able to access the materials that they would have in college. So that's the issue at the moment. And I went to see a member of staff who is on something called furlough here, which is that people are still paid a certain amount of money. They're not made redundant, but they're not coming into work. So I stand out by the, proper 2 meter distance away outside and talk and listen to somebody who just finds it difficult to see how it is to be human and what the college, what a virtual college means. So it's exciting, if sad and demanding times, but I needn't talk to you about that, as I know that you have got difficulties of your own in terms of COVID, but also in terms of natural disasters that you're enduring. So I shall stop now and open my. You can ask anything, and I'm sorry if that was a bit ad hoc, but I hope that it sort of gives you an honest confession this Lenten tide from somebody who at least is becoming more aware of just how privileged they are to be a chaplain in a small Oxford setting, when you're all having to do the work in the world.
Andrew, folks may have questions about your ministry at Oxford, and I think that the kind of reflections on your own practice of ministry was what I was really excited to hear you talk about. But if there aren't inquiries about the kind of ministry you do in chapel, I'd also love to hear about what you're thinking about academically. I mean, one of the greatest gifts I've ever received was a blank CD-ROM that you gave me. And I walked into your office and I said, I'm pretty interested in patristics. And you said, oh, here's everything. And it had a Life of Anthony, and it had the Conferences of John Cashin. And basically that CD sort of guided my progress for the next 15 years or whatever. But your work ranges from Athanasius to Francis Young, which is a very broad spectrum in so many ways. What are you thinking about at the present? What are you working on? What are you doing?
I am writing with some other with American scholars mainly, but one or two British ones about motifs like dreaming and the tree of life and how that's addressed in particularly some of the fathers like Gregory of Nyssa. My public published in the US and the UK on patristics from Nicaea to Chalcedon and on Athanasius. But that sort of it's not a, I don't think theology, and this is not to diminish archaeology at all, but it's a different discipline from archaeology. It's not trying to dig up the past, but to find out what's the dynamic, the impulse, which motivates people as diverse as Origen and Athanasius to ask questions about who this Christ is and who he invites us to be, what the nature of salvation is in terms of not being a gong or an accomplishment, but being invited into the life of God. How that was dressed up, if you like, in terms of symbolism, mythology, poetry. And so it sort of drifts. So there is, at the moment, the paper I'm teaching at the moment, I'm teaching 2 early church, but also the Jesus paper, to see how all of these things are linked. And you can't sort of cut off. Christology doesn't end at the Council of Chalcedon. And so it's if you like, the fluidity of this and approaching it. Most of my most recent publications have been in the realm of art, in terms of people like Bruegel, and looking at how artists are able to show within the life of a community the nature of the incarnate God. So that's a bit sort of off the wall in a way. It's but I can trace back and see how it's come, even though it wouldn't have been that which I predicted. In terms of writing, most recent publication, it is towards looking at some of a new ecumenism, new. But you know what I mean? I mean, ecumenism in the 1970s and 80s meant going around to the Methodist Church, singing a few hymns, saying we're all in this together, and then not taking it any further. Now, what inspiring service and all of that work with Rowan Williams, with the Roman Catholic community, the Orthodox Callistos Ware, great, lovely colleague. I don't know whether you've heard of him. He was at Pembroke before I was, as the patristics scholar. We worked together in trying to be more outward focused, an ecumenism that is focused. It's not embarrassed about worshipping together. In fact, on the contrary, every Wednesday I do go to the Orthodox Church for their Vespers, and it's amazing. It's beautifully aesthetic, and it's like being plunged into poetry and art. But what we're trying to do is to say, well, how can we motivate these people who are students who are picking up, as well, you know more than me, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars or pounds worth of debt? How can we help people not just to get trapped into the idea that they've got to go and work for Rothschild's bank for the rest of their life? They're actually sold their soul to the company store or whatever. How can we help people to see? So one of the students who quite early on did philosophy and theology, ended up becoming a barrister in the UK, and then now she is a barrister, but her faith and commitment to humanitarian causes means that she does 2.5 months a year pro bono for human rights in Uganda, and trying to support and give voice to these examples. It's not about, you know, in a sense, anyone trying to direct anybody else, but actually saying, well, these are, it's consistent with the academic development that because it's not just noetic, it's not just in one's mind, but the truth is truth. So coming back to your question, Bertie, my area now is much more, still patristic, obviously, and that's, if you like, the foundation for which I can't leave and don't want to, but it's reaching out into trying to engage with encouraging students to contribute, to be more outwardly focused. Now, the other thing, Bertie, that I do is, which is almost like the opposite of that in a way, is I'm warden of a religious community called the Sisters of the Love of God, which is it's Carmelite, Benedictine, Anglican order, and that's an enclosed world. So it's to be a sort of conduit, a connection, and hopefully try to bring some of that peaceful reflection and monastic introspection and contemplation into not only the academic life, but into the life of Pembroke. We have a lot of nuns hanging about, which is unusual. And they're all dressed up like old-fashioned nuns used to, you know. And that's quite provocative. And it's ever so interesting that Muslim women in particular really relate to nuns who are covering their head and all the rest of it. And they have incredible conversations. So what I would say in the academic realm is the moment the focus is on understanding art, and there's a book in the process called which is about, if you like, a modern artist called Maxim Kantor, who is a Russian artist. He was kicked out of Russia. He was asked by Putin to be the Minister of Culture, and Maxim, in his usual diplomatic way, said, "I will not work for fascists." So he had to leave Russia, but his work is quite profound and makes a big impact, particularly in Europe. He worked at Notre Dame University in America as a visiting artist for a while. And again, you might think, what on earth has that got to do with patristic? Well, it's about expressing the mystery and knowing when and when not to use words. You know, the worst thing you can do about a poem is to explain what every word means about it and not hear the majesty, the music, the poetry of it. And likewise, I mean, I'm hoping when I'm writing about Maxim's work and others' work, Bruegel and others, I'm not explaining the picture away, but giving people the possibility of making their own connections to visual expression. So that's what I'm interested in at the moment, as well as everything, really. Sorry, Bertie. Lost the question in my ramble.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Other questions for Andrew?
Andrew, I was really taken with your description of the ecumenical and interfaith and the diversity of your ministry as chaplain, and wonder if there's anything in that as you look back on your pastoral ministry in a parish might change the way you'd approach the community and the other faiths in the community, with that sense of sort of care for the parish in the broader sense than the church itself.
I think, if you'll excuse me for being perhaps rather autobiographical, I think my last parish was a very difficult one, in as much as it was the poshest parish in South Yorkshire. Now, South Yorkshire is not a posh place, but it had quite a sort of self-respect. People thought they'd made it. And once, when we tried to look at the vicarage, which was a Georgian rectory, had 8 bedrooms and a dovecot and a pigsty and a courtyard and a barn, and we wanted to make this a resource for the community. And I suppose I didn't listen. I thought this was such a good idea, something so no one reasonably would oppose it, that we went ahead with planning permission, and there was a steady stream of people to the door. And I suppose not only did I not listen, but I wasn't very empathetic to one or two of the things that people who had worked so hard to distinguish themselves from areas of poverty like other villages around. And one lady, I shall remember her words all my life, really. She said, "Vicar, when you have been vicar here a little longer, you will realize that this is a village to which people aspire to retire." And I'm afraid to say that I felt furious. I didn't express it, but I'm sure she felt it, because there were two primary schools and a secondary school, and it was a small community of about 8,000 people, but nowhere near were most people retired. And I just thought, and I began to, if you like, find it difficult to be at home in a parish. And I think part of that was I was quite young at that point. And I think what I would do now is try to make myself accountable to one or two people in the parish in a way that which allows people to get closer. I mean, people were lovely, but I would just love to have been able to go around and say, I know that you can't imagine, you can't sort of stop your priesthood. You don't go and say, oh, you know, X has done this today, but you to be able to be more confessional and to say, do you know, I'm finding it really difficult. I'm finding it really difficult to see why people are so obsessive about my house. And somebody might have said to me, well, actually, love, it's not your house. It's the minister's house. And perhaps they have got associations which you do not see because you've not lived here for 40 years or whatever. So I'm just hoping that in a sense, I keep on learning because it's so easy. I mean, all it needs is somebody to press your button. I mean, that's with me, I'm afraid. If people press those buttons, and almost if they know what buttons to press, you can end up being, if you like, at the beck and call of other people. And I suppose that's a good thing about the academy, because in the academy, it's all right to ask questions, even quite radical questions, whereas perhaps you might have to tread more delicately in a parish. Um, um, but it perhaps will look back and can see all the differences in a college and can see actually, well, it's only going to work if I don't get in the way. Um, and I think in parish ministry, I probably did. You know, I think there was a way in which you get caught up in England, at least, all of the nonsense about the vicar being this and that and the other. The vicar is just a servant. A beloved, I mean, in the sense as Ignatius of Antioch says into the Magnesians, that most of all he loves the deacons because they represent the servanthood of Jesus Christ. There's nothing wrong with being a servant. It's a great, most beloved thing to be. But I'm afraid I certainly, there was a deal of pride in that sense in which you don't exactly stand on your own dignity, but you don't expect to be accountable in the way that the community makes you accountable. Now, somehow, being at Pembroke has enabled me to do that. And perhaps that's having, oh, hate to admit this, I didn't even think I thought this, but perhaps that's why chaplains in the military have a certain rank in this country. And that means you have a certain authority. And perhaps in Pembroke, as a fellow, it means technically, legally, you own the place together with 24 others. And therefore you can empty yourself of stuff because there's a sort of safety net. And in a parish, there are many ways in which people will be out to press their own agendas. I don't know about how Texas is with regard to church personship, but within the last village I was, there was it was quite fragmented. There were people who were very much against the ordination of women from both sides, from a Catholic perspective and a Protestant perspective. And actually, I suppose, this is interesting, you're helping me. We did decide to take a proper risk by appointing the first woman curate when I was there. and not to be mealy-mouthed about it, and to say, and even the people who were very reluctant were completely won over because she was absolutely a gem. Um, she she was humane. She shared her doubts. She wasn't defensive. It was beautiful to see how that. But that was what I mean about taking appropriate risks. I think there was a sort of immaturity about jumping into excuse me, a quick solution for the rectory to try to make it a community provision without properly engaging with. I mean, it worked with Sue and her ministry because it was about engagement. It was about this conversation, and people. It's lovely to see people turn around. There was a lovely church warden who was very much in the Anglo-Catholic movement in England, very much against the ordination of women, and I don't think he would have sort of wanted to change his mind, because that was his, not exactly clan, but his friendship group. But he was much wiser than that, and towards the end of his life, he asked for less rights to be administered by Sue, and that's when push comes to shove, that shows that there's something very profound about that. So I guess that's it. I knew it was right to talk about taking appropriate risks, and I didn't know why, but I think you've helped me understand that in fact it's finding out what's appropriate, what's not, and then working on that which is doable, and starting discussions with no a priori assumptions about what's right, not making people feel in the wrong to say, oh, I'm not sure I believe in the ordination of women to priesthood, or I'm not sure I believe that you should have a speaker from the Jewish tradition speak in chapel. I suppose it's that sort of beginning conversations. Let's start a conversation that matters, really. So thank you.
If we have no other questions, you may need to get back to your family, and some people may need to jump off, but we do have this set of readings in our lectionary this Sunday, which I can't not ask you about because there's so much grist for patristic thought. We have the universal covenant in Noah, which you referenced before in your icon, the rainbow, and then we also have First Enoch by way of First Peter, the souls, Christ preaching to the souls in prison. I wonder if you have any random thoughts for us.
Sorry, I was muted. I was reading about that that very thing about preaching to the souls, and had a conversation this afternoon about that notion of where the dead stand. I'm sure that you're aware of, if you like, the practice, Pauline practice, which was resurrected. I choose my words carefully, in the establishment of temple covenants in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when you scratch the surface, you find it's almost a universalist church. Now, it doesn't present as that, but that's certainly something that I'll be thinking of. So what about, is there any place in the human being which is beyond the scope, the purpose, the power of God? I think of, if you like, week before last, I went and sat and read to the former master of college who died. And we thought he was unconscious, but I read, he liked the authorized version, so that's what we had. We had Psalm 23, we had, what else did we have? 1 Corinthians 13, but we finished by the end of Luke's Gospel. The end of Luke's Gospel, where Christ incognito appears to the disciples on the road to Emmaus and explains why it is necessary for the Son of Man to suffer, and makes himself known, obviously, in the breaking of bread. And actually at this man's funeral, tiny funeral, it suddenly struck me that if it were not the case that God takes to himself every human experience, weakness, strength. His power is made perfect in human weakness. And if it didn't extend to him taking responsibility and sharing completely death, but as Bart would say, that experience isn't an abdication of who this Lord is. And this Lord then goes into death. And the patristic, wonderful images of atonement in the psychological dramas of patristic atonement, rather than perhaps Anselm and later on. You have, if you like, the Lord of life being indigestible by death, even though he goes into death. So he doesn't stop being who he is. And this notion of speaking, preaching, being present to the dead. We have a wonderful phrase by Rana and von Balthasar, particularly Hans-Urs von Balthasar talks about that the real power of the resurrection is made known on the second day, when Christ goes into the very depths of human self isolation. When we are completely beyond hope, that is when the power of the resurrection is made powerful, even to the dead. The harrowing of hell is the harrowing of all our hells, but it's also that sense in which going to the place of utter hopelessness and abandonment and self-abandonment, and that's where the power of Christ's resurrection is powerfully shown. So that's what I'm glad. I haven't even thought, to be honest, of Sunday's readings. I hope they're the same ones. There probably won't be, this idea of there being a common lectionary. We are one church divided by a common lectionary all the time, but I hope it is that, because that became so powerful. During, we listened to a piece of music, and I remember looking over at the coffin, and that sense in which, had it not been that Christ was palpably present. When I also read Love 3 by George Herbert, and that was the last thing I read to the former master. And we thought he was unconscious, but he reached out and grabbed my hand quite strongly and squeezed it at the end of that poem to indicate the master knows that this is the end of the poem, but also it was eloquent in it, wordlessly eloquent. And there was a sense in which, even though human reason and rationality, we know this person is dying, he's had nil by mouth for a long time, he's not capable of recovery, there is this sense in which it is not hopeless, it is not a place of despair. So the harrowing of hell robs hell of that notion of desperation, I think. Sorry, didn't want to preach to you, but there we go.
I'm glad you did. Anything else from anyone? Well, Andrew, it's been such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us.
It's been lovely to speak to you. Lovely. And if ever any of you are virtually in Oxford on the internet, or in Oxford actually, please let me know. You can find all my details on the internet for Pembroke College, and it'd be lovely to meet some of you. I'm screening down. I keep doing this, sort of looking at the different characters who are present. So it's really nice to have met you all.
Well, thank you for taking the time. It was
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And I hope it warms up for you. Take care.
So do we. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Bertie.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, buddy.
Adios.